Hello, Emma. Hello. Can't hear you. Hello. Hello. Let me try this. Hello. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Oh, God. Okay. Right. Oh, now, can you hear me? Oh dear. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Are you hearing me out there? Problem is, I can't hear you. You try that again. You just checking the sound. Hello, everybody. Well, I can do it without listening to you, but it's not as good. Let me check my sound preferences. Ah, that should sort it. Can you hear me now? I mean, you can hear me, but I can't hear you. That is the problem. Can anybody come up with a suggestion? I'm not normally a Facebook user. You won't be able to hear us, but we can hear you. In other words, I just carry on, do I? Well, look, it's an absolute pleasure. Shall I just kick off? Because it's one-way sound, I gather. Now, I hope you can kind of see me sitting in Edinburgh, talking about America, which is a bit weird. This is the book, which is called On the Road, and which is a rather, in some ways, a straightforward book. It's an old title, as you will know, Kerouac 57, whatever it was. A novel, of course, but this isn't a novel, but it's a story. It's a pretty simple story in a way, and it has two bookends. One is Nixon, the first president to resign, and the other, of course, is Donald Trump. And I, as a teenager, as a young guy, I was just 18 when I went to America for the first time in 1970 as a British student, encountered a country which I'd never seen before, knew a lot about in the sense that I was a teenager through the 60s and I lived through all the 68 mayhem as a young guy watching it from afar. And I thought I knew quite a bit about America. Of course, I knew absolutely nothing. And I arrived there, and it was the beginning of a relationship which I suppose you could call a love affair, with its ups and downs. It's certainly an affair of enormous affection and engagement. And the reason that the bookends of the 50 years seem to me to make sense is that when I discovered America, with all its intoxication and excitement and all the things that took me to places I'd never seen, gave me a glimpse of its vastness, I encountered a country which at the same time, for all its optimism and all its excitement and all its variety, was terribly deeply troubled after the awfulness of the 60s, I suppose from 63 and Kennedy's assassination through to 68, a year of absolute turmoil, and the country had 500,000 armed men in Southeast Asia, when it was beginning to realize that the Vietnam War might not be won and the anti-war movement was taking command of public opinion. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were shot within 6 weeks of each other. Johnson couldn't run again because an anti-war candidate, Gene McCarthy, nearly beat him in New Hampshire. So it was a time of extraordinary political tension. And that feeling of optimism and excitement, which is the unique American possession, was being shattered, really, for a generation that had grown up in all the recovery and the economic expansion after the Second World War. And to look at where we are now, I've got to say, as somebody who's been coming and going a great deal over the years, writing about it and talking about it and broadcasting on the BBC about it, um, is that the America I see today, and know, I think, much better, obviously, than I did in 1970, is more divided now than it has been at any point since those Vietnam years and leading up to Watergate and the fall of Nixon in 74. It's a country that's profoundly anxious about whether the 21st century is going to be a replica of the 20th century, in which America, of course, led the industrialized world, was a gleaming symbol of democracy, seemed to be the way that, as Fukuyama said in the early 90s, you would see the end of history. In other words, some kind of liberal democracy would be established that would eventually take over the world. It was nonsense when he wrote it, of course, it was, and he probably knew it. But it focuses your mind when you think back that a lot of people said, the battle's over, the Cold War is finished. This is the kind of society we've got. And now, for a lot of Americans, even pre-virus, income's going down, college fees for the kids pretty bad, health service not dealing with a lot of people, or the health system not dealing with a lot of people who should be dealt with, feeling, hang on a minute, is the promise of perpetual progress, which we call the American dream, the one that says the next generation will always be better off than the one before. Is that still a promise which is being fulfilled? Now, for many people, it still is. But for an increasing number, it isn't. And so what I've seen, I think, in that journey is a country that has gone through extraordinary ups and downs over half a century. I mean, the excitement of post-Nixon politics, the excitement for much of the country of the arrival of Reagan, its morning in America again, 1984, will bring it all back together again. Reagan, as if he'd stepped off a rocking chair on a Norman Rockwell painting, saying, don't worry, guys, it's going to be all right. The ups and downs of the Clinton years, with all the Lewinsky stuff and everything else, but the beginning in the mid-90s of the culture war between what we might call in European terms right and left, that I think in the end has produced this most unorthodox of presidencies in Donald Trump. But I should say to anybody who I hope wants to read the book, preferably I should say bought from an indie bookshop, which will deliver, as we know, pretty well as quickly as certain online people, will discover that this isn't a book about, a meditation from in there in my part about American politics, although I hope it has some observations about what I feel about the country and its history and the way it's changed and how its country has affected me. It is actually a story of a journey. It's a story of arriving in New York on a very hot summer night in 1970 to go for a job in the Catskill Mountains in a Borscht Belt hotel, which taught me more about New York culture than in 6 weeks than I could have, learned by reading 100 books. I remember fetching up. It was the first time I'd been on a plane, first flight I'd ever taken. Nobody born in the 50s would be surprised by that. This was just the end of the 60s. And I arrived in New York. It was past midnight, the old McAlpin Hotel on Herald Square, 34th and Broadway. We were sleeping 3 or 4 to a room. I knew very little about what would face me next morning, except that I had to find my way to the Port Authority bus terminal, a short walk away on 8th Avenue, and head for the Catskill Mountains, where, so my crumpled piece of paper told me, there was a job waiting. It was past midnight. I looked from the window to Broadway far below, and the lights illuminating the crowds that wouldn't disperse. Watched the steam rising from the subway, heard the taxis honking at each other on the corner, making sure I still had my passport, which, in brackets, I do tend to lose quite frequently. I lay down, wondering, just before I slept, what lay in store in America. Well, what lay in store was a job as what they grandly called an assistant salad chef in a kosher hotel. Now, there's a slight problem with this. The salad chef couldn't understand a word I said. He was a Chinese New Yorker. I couldn't understand a word he said, and I didn't understand what the food was. I mean, I'd never seen a pickle, let alone a knish or a doodah, a Mandelbrot. I had to learn really rather quickly. But I had the most wonderful summer. And the picture that sticks in my mind from that first visit is a picture taken by a friend, 4 of us and a student, Visa went round the States on a Greyhound bus, which is what you did in those days. Some of you listening may have done it, on a B1 visa. We would go round, in our case, clockwise. So we went south to Atlanta, New Orleans, went through Texas, went to the Grand Canyon, went to LA, went up the West Coast and came back to New York. I mean, I don't know, 3,500 miles on a bus or something. And we learned about America's diversity and its vastness. And the picture that sticks with me is one which is in the book of me on the Staten Island ferry. One of my student colleagues took the picture on the ferry looking back out at the skyline, famous skyline of Manhattan. And to me, it's redolent of a wonderful summer, but what is most poignant is that behind me, as I sort of look squinting into the camera, it was a sunny day, there are the two twin towers, symbols of optimism and progress, half built. And when I see that, I think of the New York I knew with all its excitement, New York Harbor, which tells the whole story of the hordes arriving in the New World in the late 19th and early 20th century on Ellis Island, just up from the Statue of Liberty. And all the opening up and the excitement, the urgent West beckoning them on, all the rest of it. And the Twin Towers, which, of course, in my professional life, I watched not literally because I wasn't there on the day, but watched coming down like the rest of the world, and realized that at that moment, on September the 11th, 2001, the whole world, the post-Cold War world that some people had gamely thought was going to be peaceful and easy, was shattered and was thrown up in the air. 5 years later, 6 years later, the financial crisis. 8 years after that, the election of Donald Trump. So it's been a time of extraordinary turmoil. And that's why I find it so exhilarating. I mean, frankly, I find it exhilarating because to be at a convention to follow a candidate is exciting, but just as much as that, to be on a country road and to discover rural America. I remember the first time I discovered the South. To be in Washington, which I adore as a place, because it is what I imagine taking a drug is like. You just can't stop it. It becomes very exciting. And I've watched all those presidents. And I've never been a resident correspondent there, although I spent a bit of time in the Washington Post in 1981. In fact, I'll tell you about that, because I got a scholarship, the Stern Fellowship, to go and spend some time on the Post. And I met the legendary Ben Bradley, who, of course, was the editor-in-chief and had masterminded the Watergate coverage, which brought down Nixon. And I got to know Woodward and Bernstein, and that was, for a young kid coming from the Scotsman, for which I then worked, was pretty exciting. I got there, this is to the Washington Post, just before Independence Day. There was a bit of talk in the office of what I, a non-American, might do on the day. I said it might be fun to go into the Appalachians, wander about a bit in the backwoods and write something about the American heartland. Crap, said Ben Bradley. Everybody does that. So I asked rather nervously what he thought might be a better idea. Go to Reagan's party, he said. I'll fix it. And he did. It was 1981. Reagan had just arrived in the White House. And I went to his party on the South Lawn of the White House on his first Independence Day as president, 3 months after he'd been the victim of an assassination attempt, from which most people believe he never truly recovered. And I think personally that in my time watching America and loving it and going on holidays as well as for work, the two big figures who have shaped it in our time, one much more recognized abroad than the other, were Reagan and Obama. Obama, for obvious reasons, living out, as Martin Luther King said, the meaning of its creed in the Constitution, finally, or the Declaration of Independence, finally, more than, a century after Lincoln had won the Civil War and lost his life as a consequence. But Reagan, I think, the most underestimated president abroad. Of course, people were right, and Margaret Thatcher, who in some ways adored him because of their fellow feeling about certain matters, she understood this very well. Reagan had limited capacity when it came to, policy analysis, but he had an ineffable touch for the public mood. and he stabilized America. There's no question about that. And even people who objected to his politics and his policies would accept that. And more to the point, I think he, in his shadow, bequeathed strength to a conservative movement, a deeply ideological movement, as it became 10 years afterwards, much more ideological than Reagan would have wanted, I suspect, which gave birth, in a way, to all the unease and the culture disaffection with liberal America that led to the rise of Trump himself. Now, I should say, I want to answer questions and not just talk and talk and talk. I should say that this book is emphatically not about Donald Trump, because I think, as I say somewhere in the book, if it were, he would take it over inevitably. And but what I try to do, I think, and it's unashamedly anecdotal, and I hope tells a lot of good stories, is to explain how it came about, and we might talk about this in the next half hour, 3/4 of an hour, how it came about that he was elected in the first place. I remember vividly going to see one of his supporters, as he had not been at the beginning of the primary process in 2016, Anthony Scaramucci. Now, Scaramucci, known as the Mooch to everybody, became head of communications in the White House for a few days, literally a few days. Got the job on a Monday, was sacked on a Friday a couple of years later. And like so many press secretaries of Trump, he just fell under the wheels of this unstoppable wagon and had to go. And he's now an absolute Trump denier. He won't have anything to do with him. He's going to vote for Biden. But Scaramucci said to me in his building in New York about 3 days before the election, and I went to see him and said, "How's it going?" And at that stage, you know, the Clinton campaign was clearly having trouble, but people still didn't really believe that Trump would be elected, including, I believe, very strongly, with some evidence, Trump himself. Anyway, the Mooch talked and he said, "Well, I think we've got a 55% chance of winning." I didn't believe him. I don't think he did either. But anyway, we had a pleasant conversation, recorded something for the BBC. And he was walking to me to the elevator to say goodbye. And he's a very genial character. Not sure you could buy a second-hand car from him, but it's a very genial character anyway. And sharp. He owned a third of the Mets baseball team, which I was very interested in, and we talked about that for a long time. But anyway, he said, "Look, I'll tell you one thing that we've absolutely sorted out." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "If Donald is elected on Tuesday, he's given us, on the campaign, an absolute assurance that he will stop tweeting." Well, I've got reason to think of that several times a day because I have the misfortune to follow him on Twitter. What we've now got is an America which is more melodramatic, as if such a thing were possible, than the place I first encountered in the early 70s, with a disaffected Vietnam generation, with people beginning to wonder whether the prosperity that had characterized the century was going to remain, whether their kids would be as fortunate as they were. And now you've got a disaffection and a difficulty which I think is even more profound, not because it's shared by the whole population. It clearly isn't. There is a section of the population, let's call it 30% of the voting population for the sake of argument, which will believe Donald Trump, whatever he says about various vaccines and, you know, where the virus came from in a lab in China, whatever he says, because he represents a cultural antagonism to a liberal America which they have grown up in the last 25 years to loathe and to describe as the source of all America's ills. And on the other side, of course, you have liberals, whatever we call them, people on the liberal left of politics. Left, incidentally, was a word that never used to be used about America. Trump's very successfully imported it in so that everybody who disagrees with him is somehow on the left. Anyway. And of course, they loathe the president with a passion. At the moment, he's behind in the polls nationwide. We'll come to Joe Biden later, I've no doubt. On any rational calculation, a president facing the kind of crisis that's going on in America now, where everybody knows someone who's either lost their job or is ill or is dead from the virus, you know, we're soon going to be at a figure which is double the number, which was 60,000 roughly, who lost their lives in Vietnam. It's an extraordinary figure. And any president facing that kind of crisis is bound to face questions about how it was handled, not where it came from, how it was handled, which are very, very difficult. Trump's running roughly 4, 5, 6% behind Biden in the polls nationwide. That does not mean that he will lose. It'll be decided in 5 states, basically Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida, where the big electoral college votes are. And in those states, it'll be a battle royal, and it will be the dirtiest campaign any of us has ever seen. That's what we said in 2016. It was true about that campaign. It's going to be true in spades this time, because Donald Trump does not like to lose. And everything he believes in projects the world into a sort of New York property deal where one guy wins and one guy loses. Doesn't matter whether you're dealing with the Middle East, with Europe and NATO, with Putin, with North Korea. Somebody wins sometimes, and if someone wins, someone loses. That's how he sees it. So it's going to be rough, tough. And if you expect me to predict who's going to win, all I will say is that if you were following historical precedent, there is no question that Trump will lose. But if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Having said that, this is not a political lecture. This is, I hope, a book of anecdotage, stories. You know, the day I ran into Mayor Daley of Chicago in a lavatory in Madison Square Garden, which is a story that I never thought I'd put down in paper, but now I have. So if that doesn't get you going, I don't know what will. I think that's just kind of an opening blast. Buy the book from an indie bookshop, of course, nowhere else. And I'll keep my eye on here and I'll see what your questions are. All right? I need this thing to start moving. Hello. Keep them. Is somebody coming? I should see. Ah, here we go. Emma, are you going to drop something into the thing? I'm looking at the live thing on the left-hand side. Is that what I should be? Or I should be looking at the... Here we go. Hang on. Where am I I'm not getting your... Not getting your notes. Rather horrifyingly, I've come up on the screen again. What are your views regarding Barack Obama? Well, Obama's election was the most extraordinary thing that a whole generation of Americans had seen. And I remember the first time I met him, which was in Chicago in 2004, when he was running for a Senate seat where he became Democratic candidate almost by accident. He was a little-known state senator in Illinois because there had been a sex scandal, and the Republican sitting senator who was running for re-election had really been tossed over the edge. So Obama was able to come in, and very few people outside Illinois had heard him. He'd made a famous speech at the Democratic Convention, as it subsequently became in Boston. And anyway, I went to see him as he was campaigning, and it was in Jesse Jackson's church. Jackson, a great sort of Democratic campaigner based in Chicago. And there was Obama and Michelle Obama and their kids, and he was going to go out leafleting. I mean, literally putting leaflets through people's doors. It was that splendidly old-fashioned at the time. And I asked if he would do an interview, and he said, yeah, and we had to do it outside on the pavement. And I wondered why. And he said, well, I've got to do it outside. And there was traffic, and it was loud, and I was trying to record him. I didn't understand why until we got outside, because, of course, he couldn't speak for more than 3 or 4 minutes without having a cigarette in those days. Those days are gone. But anyway, he was eloquent, persuasive, wonderfully fluent, of course. Anyway, off he went leafleting, and I went in and sat down with Jackson for a while, and he said, look, that people of his generation, the Martin Luther King generation in the South, had always said, when could there be a black president? And he said that he and Ralph Abernathy and all these people had come to realize that their generation could never do it. Too much, sorry, somebody's ringing me. Too much water had passed under the bridge. They were old hat. And I said, well, Obama's very impressive, but, why, are you seriously saying he'd become president of the United States? And he said, oh, yeah. I said, you watch him. This is the one. And that was October 2004. By November 2008, this skinny kid, as he called himself, state senator from Illinois, was president. I think he's one of the most remarkable communicators I've ever seen. I mean, here, Europe, or in the States, nobody can argue with that. And what you've got to remember about Obama's presidency is that he came to it with zilch experience. I mean, 4 years as senator. And he was hit 2 months before he was elected by the biggest financial crisis the world had seen since the 1930s. So he was hobbled from the start. Now, I'm not saying that he got everything right. I think Middle East progress, for example, on the international scene was very limited. I'm not sure he played Putin very wisely. But I think what Obama brought to American life was profound and remarkable. And I suspect people will be reminded of that in the next 6 months. That's all I would say. I'm looking here. Why did you decide to write this book now? Well, it's kind of 50 years, which is bizarre. Which tells you, I was born in the early 50s. And it just seemed right because the bookends of Nixon and Trump just seemed to me to encompass an era in the States where people were asking after that 50 years had passed, if they were old enough, well, hang on a minute. We thought we were recovering after the nightmares of the 60s and Watergate. Have things really changed for the better permanently? And for somebody who's been travelling around and watching it, it just seemed a good time to do it. And I wanted to reflect, my own experiences, enjoying myself in America. I mean, I went out last year, it's about 13 months ago, and did something I'd always wanted to do, which was to take the overnight train from Chicago to New Orleans and back, and go to Graceland and Memphis on the way, which mysteriously I'd never visited Graceland before. The Presley Shrine, of course. You'll know the famous Steve Goodman song, City of New Orleans, which is the name of the train. Arlo Guthrie's recording, I think, is the best. Some would say Willie Nelson, but let's not argue about that. But to take this train down between two of the great cities, utterly different. Chicago frozen in ice in February. I mean, the great Mailer called it the Great American City, and I can see that. Going down to this sultry, strange, exotic, subtropical place, New Orleans, which of course was the symbol of feeble federal government in Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when how many people? I don't know, 1,500 people died, some of them lying exhausted on the floor of the football stadium because they couldn't be fed, and their houses were sunk under the waters after the levees had failed to stand up to the surge from the Gulf. And it represented in some ways the failure of the most advanced society in the world to look after its most vulnerable people. And Chicago, the great symbol of, although it's associated, of course, with gangsterism and political corruption and all the rest of it, fantastic city, which many of you watching will have visited or will know. I mean, architecturally fabulous, one of the greatest policies of public art in the civilized world. So I took this train for 3 days, and it reminded me that what I love about the place is the people, the difference, the shared histories, the cultures that sometimes talk across great gulfs one to another, but which still feel themselves part of this melting pot. And I think one of the tragedies of the moment is that, let me put this carefully, many Americans feel that Donald Trump doesn't speak for the diversity of that country, which is becoming ever more diverse. I mean, if you look at the population of Texas, it's moving extraordinarily quickly towards a situation in which the Latino Hispanic population will be the biggest single element in the state. And the whole culture is changing as fast as New York changed in the 1890s, with the Irish and the Italians and the Russians, or did in the 1920s. And I'm always reminded of those great last lines of Gatsby, where Nick Carraway, the Fitzgerald's narrator says, and so we beat on boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past. It's the most inventive country in the world where things change more quickly than anywhere else. And yet it is bound, I think in many ways wonderfully, but also painfully, to its history and its past. Let me just see. I'm sorry about the phone ringing there. What are you most looking forward to when you get out of lockdown? Oh, just moving around. Nixon, hang on. Nixon tried to open the relationship with China. Well, let me get back to this. Are you optimistic about the future of America? Yes. America will be hopeful. I'll just read you the last two chapters of the. Don't worry, not the last two chapters. Last couple of paragraphs. I took the first time I did an Atlantic crossing on the Queen Mary coming back. It was a literary festival at sea, the Cheltenham Literary Festival last year, and I came back away from the city. It's just coming home on the ocean in the dark, a week and 3,000 miles away from home. I wondered where Trump would take his country in his effort to survive in office and win re-election, and how Americans would respond. It wasn't an entirely melancholy thought. For all its problems, this is a country where idealism still thrives, an inheritance that most of its people, wherever they stand on the political spectrum, understand and cherish in their own ways. But for someone who first came to the country when it was racked with the agony of a war that divided families and generations, and was about to be thrown into an era of political scandal that would challenge faith in government, Watergate, there was an electric symmetry about this moment. A president impeached, a country angry with itself, riven by a war of cultures, looking fearfully beyond its shores. Travelling these roads has been to realise that America is as restless as it has ever been. People wonder, because they've been taught to, whether it can long endure, it's a quote from the Gettysburg Address, as the country it thinks itself to be. But with a persistence that never fails, it retains the spirit that would still persuade a young visitor, like me I suppose, to come back and to hit the road once more. And that spirit is hope. And I believe that very strongly. Nixon tried to open the relationship with China. He did, and he was a strangely complicated and dark man, as we know, and of course he was looking for his place in history. But he did have an understanding of some of the big questions, having been a red baiter in the 40s and 50s. And I think the China expedition was something which was remarkable. And I think people on our side of the Atlantic don't realise what a huge leap that was, to see Nixon on the Great Wall and to see him with Mao. And I think that was, a change that will stand the test of time. I doubt in foreign policy whether Trump will aspire to anything as big. Do you think America will see a female president in the next 10 years? Well, that's interesting, and it brings us to the Biden question. You will know that Joe Biden has said in terms that he will choose a female vice presidential candidate. Now, of course, this has a particular importance because Biden is, in his late 70s, 77. And therefore, the choice of vice president is more pregnant with possibilities, in the sense that it's more likely than not, the common view has it, that Biden will be a one-term president if he were to win, and that he will say in 2023, I'm going to be 80, and I don't believe that in the modern world somebody should be president when they're 80. He won't say this before he's elected, clearly, but if he were elected. So the chances are that if he chooses a woman president, their vice presidential candidate, then that person could be in a very, very strong position to be the successor. And the names, of course, are the very obvious names. Elizabeth Warren, who fought for the nomination and failed. Amy Klobuchar, who's regarded as kind of moderate, it's a hopeless word, isn't it, moderate? But anyway, Midwestern senator, and Kamala Harris, one of the senators from California. And I think it'll be one of those three. I can't see it being anybody else. I would have thought there's an extremely strong chance. Of course, somebody thought it would be her in 2016. I did a long interview with her, which is in the book. And Hillary Clinton, imagine on that night in November 2016, she was sitting in a hotel in New York, and less than half a mile from Trump Tower, writing her acceptance speech for the presidency of the United States when the news came that things had gone bad in Wisconsin and Michigan, and worst of all for her in Pennsylvania, where her father came from, Scranton, which incidentally is also Joe Biden's hometown. And she knew it was all over. And she had to ring Trump up. And I said to her, what was it like? What was the phone call like when you rang him to concede? And she said, well, it was very brief. And I said, what else? And she said, he was absolutely stunned. He didn't know it was coming. I think that's right. Who was my favourite president and why? Lincoln. And it's something Hillary Clinton said to me, actually. We had a long conversation in New York just about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. I went to see her and sat down, and it wasn't a sort of bang, bang, bang thing for broadcast. I wanted her to talk about history. And she said there's absolutely no question that Lincoln, who saw through the Civil War and in the Gettysburg Address, which I mentioned earlier, greatest piece of oratory in modern Western political history. And it was 272 words, quite extraordinary. And that was all about generosity. And his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, and so on. He was a man of incredible gifts, of intellect and soul. And if he had survived and hadn't lost his life to an assassin's bullet, I think he could have pulled the country together. And I think the racial divide, which is still, as Clinton put it to me, the original sin, which has not been expiated and is still the source of so much difficulty in that country, would have been healed much earlier than it has been. I'm sure that's true. Sue Porter, again, your Radio 4 book club was enjoyed by many. Well, don't say was, is. Oh, still going. Favourite book and author? Oh, goodness me. I mean, I can't even start. I mean, talking to Joseph Heller about Catch-22 was quite something. Just in American terms, Gore Vidal, all these. But I mean, I keep discovering new authors as well. So, it's wonderful. And it's a great thing. And we've got a very loyal audience on Radio 4, which follows the books. I've just, done a couple that will be coming out quite soon. And, we go from sort of highfalutin, quite serious literary fiction to still, I'm doing recording one with Scott Turow next month, who, wrote that wonderful thriller Presumed Innocent, which is the start of that great genre of legal thrillers. So I love them all. I mean, that's a hopelessly kind of waffly answer, but I'm not going to pick anybody out. There have been some remarkable ones, though. I remember years and years and years ago getting Alan Bennett to talk about his parents for the first time. I mean, he does it all the time now, but that was quite something. Clive James talking about his family. John Irving, who was supposed to be very, very difficult, and people warned me about him, and he absolutely loved it because he's got 25 highly intelligent, literate Radio 4 readers sitting around him who are anxious to know. Of course, here's the secret, authors rather like that. But it's great, great fun. What version of the American dream do you think the youth in the US are being sold today? Well, that's from Genevieve Barrow. Well, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, they're being sold a version which it seems to me is not in keeping with the best traditions of American democracy and society. I mean, I think the America First message, which is, of course, the Trump slogan, is, I think, deeply antithetical to the truth of the best kind of optimism in America. The story I enjoy from Trump's inauguration was, it's in the book, but Trump's inaugural was a very dismal affair. It was on an awful January day in 2017, cold, wet. I was watching it from a stand back quite a long way from the Capitol with sort of binoculars so that I could see. And I was walking back up Pennsylvania Avenue with a friend from the Washington Post, and I said that I was hoping to get a ticket on the way home in New York for the musical Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, was really a kind of sort of prime minister to Washington, really, had become a hip-hop star in the musical. And he said to me, he's a wise old bird, he said to me, you do realize that the script for the Trump presidency is not going to be written by Alexander Hamilton. It's going to be written by Mario Puzo, author of The Godfather. Make of that what you will. But I think the version of events, which is, as I said, a sort of binary view of the world where everything is a contest in which somebody wins and somebody loses, and there's no sense of a national effort to bring people together. It's a series of deals that have to be concluded, I think is a betrayal, really, of the best aspects of American optimism that have, waxed and waned over the years, but have given that country an extraordinary inventiveness and an ability to absorb different peoples, different cultures, to give them new hope after depressions, times of agony. And I think in that sense, those who believe that America First is the best slogan need to remember that America First was the slogan that was used in the 1930s by American isolationists who were happy to march under a swastika and object to American involvement in Europe because the New World, as we know, came to rescue the old in 1941. And I think that those with a sense of history would realize that the kind of cul-de-sac that is Trump's vision, if that is the word, is not one that the youth of America should want to go up. Whether they'll choose to or not in 6 months, who knows? Stacey Abrams, somebody says, Mary Suller is being considered as a VP candidate along with Susan Rice. Now, they're both black women, and I think, says Mary Suller, that Joe Biden should select a black woman because he owes so much to black women for his political... Well, that's all true. I think, though, there is a problem. Stacey Abrams, who didn't get the governorship of Georgia, although she probably should have, with a man in his late 70s, it is vitally important that there is somebody who has got the experience and capacity to step into, the most powerful elected office in the world, properly elected office. And I just don't believe you can do that with her background. I mean, I don't think she's done enough. Susan Rice is a different question. Was a national security advisor to Bill Clinton's, very, very serious person, and I'm sure she's on the list. Say, should select a black woman because he owes so much to black women for his political success. That's true, but of course, paying off debts in choosing a vice presidential candidate isn't good enough, really. As various presidential candidates have discovered, it needs to be something bigger. It needs to be somebody who has got the bigness. Of course, there's a huge movement to try to get Michelle Obama to be considered. Personally, I've no information about this, but I would be absolutely astonished if she even dreamt of wanting to dive back into that. But relations between the Obamas and Biden are very, very close. I mean, I saw Biden last in New Hampshire, where he had a dreadful weekend and he dashed off to South Carolina at the next primary because he knew he was going to get thrashed. And I was present at quite an intimate thing, actually, there were only a few of us there, where Biden talked for an hour or so about his anger and irritation about all these young whippersnappers, Pete Buttigieg and so on, coming up, not in bitterness against them, but, why am I not recognized for what I've done? 32 years in Washington, 8 years as vice president. And, of course, he cleaned up later. And I think Biden is actually wise enough to know that you don't do a cheap deal for the number 2 slot and just pay off a debt. You have to be able to stand up and say to the American people, look, I'm getting on. Trump's going to say he's got dementia, he's past it. You can hear it now. He's got to have somebody that's standing up there who can be president tomorrow and can stand up to Putin. And I think with the best will in the world, that ain't Stacey Abrams. What trends have you noticed? What happens after Trump? Well, it's a question of whether it's after Trump or whether Trump gets 4 more years. I was part of a discussion last week with 2 very, very distinguished American journalists online, one from the New Yorker and one from CBS News. And they were saying, there's a real question. If Trump loses in November narrowly, he will argue that there have been some fiddles in the votes, and he might just refuse to leave the White House. What happens then? So before we talk about um, trends after Trump, I think we need to talk about what actually happens in November. And I talked to a very serious American academic last year in the course of coverage for the BBC who said to me that his real worry, and I don't know what his precise politics are, he's sort of centrist kind of guy, and I imagine he's voted for Democrat and Republican candidates for president in his time. I would bet that he had. And he said to me privately, and I can't use his name, that he wouldn't. That what really worried him, and he's a historian and a psophologist and a very very deep thinking man. He said what really worried him was that if Trump thought he was going to lose in November, 2 weeks out, he was capable of doing anything. It rather worried me. Mike King asks, populist politics in the USA and the UK, do you think global issues will be ignored for several years until there's a rebalance? Well, of course, it's a huge question. And Trump has systematically gone to war against international institutions, the UN, the WHO and the virus outbreak, the World Bank, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. I mean, his is a whole argument against multilateralism, against NATO, against anything which is cooperative across borders, because that does not conform with an America First agenda. Well, the problem is he's discovering it doesn't work. It doesn't make America richer, safer, or better. And at some point, the pendulum will swing. And certainly, if Biden were to win, I think instantly you would get a completely different American attitude to the question of climate change, to the question of international development, to the question of cooperation across a whole range of issues. And certainly in NATO, there would be huge sighs of relief. I mean, I did a BBC documentary based in Germany not long ago about the view of Trump's foreign policy on Europe, and the Germans are absolutely terrified. And, you know, they've got Poland on their doorstep, and they've got Putin controlling gas supplies along the road, as it were. And they were absolutely horrified that here was an American president who would go into a meeting in Helsinki with Putin and wouldn't talk to his allies beforehand about what was going to be said, what was in the agenda, which has been standard practice for 50 years, and didn't tell anybody afterwards what had been said. I mean, it's extraordinary, completely unprecedented. So we will have a swing back, unless, of course, Donald Trump wins, at which point I think there's going to be big trouble in America. I think there'll be trouble in the streets. Jim Fallows of The Atlantic, who is a wonderful correspondent, very, very seasoned political observer, did work in the Carter White House, so that's where he comes from politically. But he's an extremely distinguished commentator. And he said to me before Trump's inauguration, on a taped interview, that he thought that the United States was facing, as a consequence of Trump's election, the biggest challenge to its democratic institutions since the Civil War. And there are a lot of people who think, looking at the judges that are being appointed and so on, that that is a fair comment. That's big stuff. So there will be a rebalancing, but for many Americans, it can't come soon enough. Fiona Chamberlain, an American friend of mine, says his countrymen like to vote for a presidential candidate they think is less clever than themselves. Do you recognise that? Well, I'm not sure that's true. It wasn't true about Clinton. Clinton's an extraordinarily bright man and never tried to pretend to be anything else. Obama is a very bright man, I mean, intellectual by bent. Carter, although, you know, people like to say, oh, he's a peanut farmer. Well, come on, he was a senior officer on a naval nuclear submarine. Carter's an extremely, extremely clever man. Reagan was a figure of his time, and people wanted to feel comfortable with Reagan. And they said, look, we don't worry if he doesn't know very much. He seems to speak for us, and he's going to try to bring this country together. That's what they believed about Reagan. And my response to your question, Fiona, would be that I think what Americans it's a terrible generalization, but in the spirit of the question, it's not that they like to vote for somebody that's less clever than themselves. They like to vote for somebody who is a good guy, as it's always been, to be with. And, when Al Gore and George Bush fought it out to basically a score draw in 2000, I found again and again and again people, when asked the question, who would you rather sit at a baseball game with, George W. or Al Gore, who would bore your pants off on climate change or whatever? And they would have said, well, Bush seems a nice guy, compassionate conservative from Texas, his own description. And I think that's really it. And I think where Biden is scoring heavily on Trump, it's not a question of intelligence. It's fundamentally a question of decency. And I think in the end, there will be a lot of people who will go down the road with Trump. There'll be a lot of people who've got doubts about Biden for all kinds of reasons, either because they're to the left of him or because they just don't like, liberals. But I think on the likability question, Biden will be miles ahead. Now, that will test my theory as to whether in the end, with a few exceptions, Nixon being one, people will vote for the person that they like more. The reason they couldn't stand Michael Dukakis, who most of you have forgotten, was the Democrat candidate in 1988. It appeared like a stuck-up, remote, Boston liberal who'd never stepped out of New England. And people just hated that, just didn't like it. Bob Dole, 96 running against Bill Clinton. Bob Dole's a spiky, quite unpleasant character. And they thought, this old Bill, well, he gets up to stuff, but we quite like it. And, Clinton, Lewinsky and the blue dress and all the rest of it, Clinton left office with approval ratings that were almost as high as Reagan's, the two of them the highest approval ratings on leaving office since FDR. So it's likability, I think, more than cleverness. Here we go. Special relationship, the most overrated phrase in the world. We like to say we've got a special relationship because we can do deals. Well, yes, there is a very, very special relationship in defense and intelligence, and that's really what it's based on. If the American taxpayer knew how much they pay for GCHQ, they'd be rather surprised. So that's the guts of the special relationship, NATO and defense. And of course there is more or less a shared language. But the truth is that we've long since stopped punching above our weight in Washington. I mean, there's a kind of warmth that has got to do with history. But, the American heartbeat is not so rooted in our country now as it was. It's much more rooted in Asia and elsewhere. And I think there's a romance and a sentimentality about it, none of which I object to and rather enjoy. But I think there's a great danger in overstating it. I mean, the idea that a British Prime Minister can stomp into the White House and cut more weight than a German Chancellor, those days are long gone. I mean, the real special relationship in Washington is with the Prime Minister of Israel. More important than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in raw politics. Right, just leave you with that thought. Malcolm McMaster, you mentioned judges. Do you think people outside the US recognise how McConnell's driving the judicial scene? Come to think of it, do Americans understand this? A reference to Mitch McConnell, of course, who is leader of the Senate, the majority of Republicans in the Senate. And just to explain, many of you will know this, but for those of you who don't or find it all a bit weird, the way the Senate runs on very antediluvian lines really means that the majority leader, if he's got a majority he can count on, which McConnell has, he can decide what goes to committee, what doesn't go to committee, and in fact on judicial appointments, which all have to be approved above a certain level in the superstructure by the Judiciary Committee of the Senate, controlled of course by the majority party, i.e. the Republicans at the moment. He can basically ram through judges, and if he doesn't care, and in his case he doesn't, about getting bipartisan agreement, he can just push them through. And it's not just a question of the Supreme Court justices, only 9 of those. And vacancies come up very rarely, although he behaved disgracefully with one at the end of the Clinton, the Obama years in office. It's federal judgeships right down the system where people are appointed for life. And the American Bar Association, lawyers' body, is extremely perturbed because a considerable number of judges who are regarded by them as unfit to sit on the federal bench have been approved by the Senate controlled by Mitch McConnell. And I think it's a huge, huge question. And a lot of that will take a long time to unravel. The key thing for Democrats, and it would be foolish to pretend that most Americans follow this closely, they don't, but those who do are absolutely passionate about it. The Supreme Court is on a 5-4 balance. It's very, very difficult to be rigid about these things, but broadly speaking, there is a Conservative majority which will vote on the big cases for a limited role for government. That's the dividing line, and would be very happy for extensions of corporate power and so on. The next president will probably have 2 vacancies. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, famous liberal justice, is in her 80s, well into her 80s, had a fall and people got very worried on the liberal side of the argument. The next president will probably have 2 or 3 appointments in the Supreme Court, and that will change it for a generation. This is crucially important. As Clinton said about the economy in 96, somebody said, what's his campaign about? The famous quote written on the wall of 92, actually, it's the economy, stupid. Well, actually, in American elections now, it's the court, stupid, because the Supreme Court is going to control so much. Sorry, I'm getting long-winded. Really enjoying this. I've learned a lot. Well, I know you've learned a lot. I have a beef with, this is Mike King again, I like him. I've got a beef with professional politicians and advisors that are more distant than ever from the people and a very limited knowledge of business. What are your thoughts? Well, some of them have little knowledge of business. You're talking about Dominic Cummings, I don't know. I mean, in the States, look, the tyranny of the political hired gun who just comes in and sees everything as a game. You win and you lose. Brexit, take back control. Don't get into the argument. Find a slogan, do it. I think that is something which does sap some of the intellectual and emotional energy from politics and turns it into a kind of game show, which of course it's Trump's world. And it happens across parties in the States as it does across parties here. But I think one of the interesting things, it was nothing to do with America, but it's been quite interesting to watch the House of Commons in the last few weeks without the baying hordes on both sides. And I suspect that when this is all over, people might think that they've got a better instinct about Johnson and Starmer, wherever they stand on the political spectrum, than they would if they were watching them in the middle of a baying bear pit. I just leave that thought with you. That's not really about advisors, but it's on the same thing. We must keep our wonderful Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's Mary Suller again. Yes, well, indeed, I think there are many people who, but she seems all right. So I'm told. I don't know, but I think the court is desperately important. And any of you joining in who are Americans will realise that there are huge questions that come to the court, particularly about voting rights, about what you broadly call desegregation questions in education and society generally, and about, for example, the funding of political campaigns. There was a decision a few years ago, which some of you will be aware of, called Citizens United, which effectively meant that years of attempts to pull money out of the system and stop corporations being able to buy candidates was turned back. And that's going to be very difficult to reverse. But I think people who care about open democratic systems are generally very unhappy about that decision. And so the court is the place where the buck stops. And if Trump is re-elected, then he is going to come slap bang up against the Supreme Court on some big, big questions and prepare for fireworks. But my gut instincts, that won't happen. How are we doing? We've gone over an hour, haven't we? I hope that all I would say, listen, can I just conclude with this? This is, thank you, Mary Sula, for saying you're correct. The Supreme Court's very important. That's the book. Do buy it from a reputable indie bookshop like those represented here tonight. And I think, well, I hope you enjoyed. Basically, what I wanted to do was to tell a story that sounded as if we were sitting by a fire on a winter's evening. And I was saying, look, here's one guy, I've got my views and I've got my own experiences, and they're not unique, but they're individual. And since I've spent my life writing and broadcasting, it's a story worth telling. And there's one quote I'll just finish with. Alistair Cook was a great hero of mine, did more to explain America to Brits than anybody else of his generation. And at the end of his majestic TV series on America, called America, in 1972, and he'd go right through the whole story, Pilgrim Fathers, the works, the whole history of the Constitution, everything right through the Depression. And he explained his own amazing love affair with the country and his absorption in it from the 1930s on. And he looked at the camera for almost the last shot in the film of the series. It was one of these vast series like, Civilization and the Ascent of Man. He said this: in this land of the most persistent idealism and the blandest cynicism, the race is on between its decadence and its vitality. And I think that race is still on today. And I know which urge, I hope, prevails. Thank you all very much for joining in. And if you've got a chance, do enjoy the book. Goodbye.